Sure. My name is Steve Persch. I'm a senior engineer and team lead with Palantir.net. We're a full-service digital agency based out of Chicago. We do web design, development, strategy. We work a lot with open source technologies. A lot of people know us most as a Drupal company. We also do work with Symfony, WordPress, all kinds of stuff. To get a sense of who's in the room, I'm curious who here considers themselves first and foremost a site builder. Is your job to build sites for clients, to build sites internally? Who here has the job of theming Drupal websites, making it look right? Writing template files, writing CSS for Drupal preprocess functions. Who here is often most responsible for writing modules, either custom modules, contrib modules, all that? Okay, great. So we've got a diverse group. That's good because we'll be talking about theming, but we're also going to be talking about it in the full context of building sites, working with contrib modules. So in the title of this talk, I've got past, present, and future, and I'll be talking about specific ideas around managing templates, around managing your CSS, and I'll be talking about some of those ideas as ideas of the past, ideas of the future. The future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed yet. So these ideas in and of themselves are not future ideas or old ideas, they're just ideas about how we organize our work. And the given circumstances of the past, present, and future change the way we use our tools. So in building Drupal sites, what are we doing? I'm going to be asking this question a lot. What are we actually doing when we make a Drupal site, a Drupal module, a Drupal theme? Well, by one definition, web programming is the science of coming up with increasingly complicated ways of concatenating strings. At the end of the day, we need to serve a web page. That web page is HTML. That's a string that we need to send from the server to the browser. And by this measure, Drupal developers are really, really good scientists. We've come up with some really complex ways of concatenating strings. And I want to talk about our main concatenator, the theme function. It's been in Drupal for a very long time. Theme item list, one of our oldest theme functions. It was added to Drupal Core in 2002. And the way we use it today is very similar to the way it was used when it was originally added. The basic idea of the theme function, if you want to make an item list, is you build up a PHP array. You can give it a title of grocery list. You can put grocery items in your array, a relatively simple data structure. You then call the theme function, and you say, theme function, I want an item list. And the theme system already knows conceptually what an item list is. You call the theme function, give it your array. What you get back is some relatively simple HTML. You get back a UL, some LIs. You get your grocery list. Not too complex. So you're telling the theme system what you want to print. I want an item list. You say, here are my variables. The theme system will then call the PHP function, theme underscore item list. And if you want to override that, if you want to customize, you can do so in your site theme. My site theme item list, my client item list, Acme item list. This concept is near identical to when it was first introduced over a decade ago. You've got your theme functions, and you can override them. It gets complicated pretty quickly. Let's look at theming a node. You can use the node load function, load your node, and then you tell the theme function, I would like to theme a node, please. I want to print this node. Call the theme function, give it the argument of node, give it an array, say here's my node. This detail has changed with each major version of Drupal. Now we're using render arrays instead of calling the theme function directly. But what you get back after passing in that node variable is something like this. You get back a very complex set of HTML, some really verbose CSS classes, and that raw node object that you passed in has been transformed in a very complex way to get it ready to print out like this. The basic idea is that you're telling the theme system still, I want to print a node. Here's my variable. But unlike that item list, where it was almost self-evident how that item list goes from a raw PHP array to an HTML item list, it's not at all apparent just by looking at your raw node object and looking at that markup how you got from one to the other. In that markup, we saw that the username was printed and a link to the username of the author. Well, on that raw node object, it was just UID2. How did we get from 2 to a link to the user? We got to it through a complex preprocess layer. Drupal will check 10 layers of available preprocessing: template preprocess, module preprocess, sub-theme preprocess, active theme preprocess, all these different preprocess layers to, some people call it hydrate that node. Go from a dehydrated user ID 2 to something that you can actually print. And that eventually ends up in node.tpl. And if you want to override, you can do so with template suggestions. You can make node-blogpost.tpl, node-teaser.tpl. And this concept is pretty much the same as it was many versions of Drupal ago. So, talking about the past, present, and future, I'm going to be referring to the past, the Drupal 5, Drupal 6 era, as the era of sustainable theming. Around this time, Palantir.net, the company I work for, did a series of blog posts on this idea of sustainable theming. And Colleen Carroll, now our Director of Operations, at the time a front-end developer, described sustainable theming as an extensible design, a design toolkit that can evolve over the life of a project. You want your design and theme to stay intact as you add new content types, new layouts. So these are pretty good goals, and goals that we still have today. The way we went about achieving those goals in 2008, 2009 was different from how we do it now because the given circumstances were different then. In the Drupal 5 era, it was a given that the designs of the website would be JPEGs, probably coming from Photoshop. So you've got JPEGs, you've got PSDs, you have PDFs, you have a picture of what your website is supposed to look like. That's just a given on just about any project in 2008, 2009. And it's a given that if you're building in Drupal 5, Drupal 6, any version of Drupal, that as soon as you start doing anything, as soon as you start adding content types, adding content, you're going to get a ton of HTML for free. Whether or not you want it, you're going to get all of those layers of divs. It's a given that Core is going to be naming each layer of div. Each CSS class is going to somehow reflect the internal layer of Drupal that produced that div. So you get classes like node-article. That tells me this is a representation of an article. You get classes like field-name-field-image. That tells me the machine name of this field is field image. A lot of people look down on these classes now. They say this is not how we want to style things. But in 2008, 2009, a lot of us were really excited to get these extremely descriptive class names that told us exactly where this was coming from. And if we want to do something, we know, well, we can do something for all images of type field or all images named field image because our CSS tells us exactly where this is coming from. It's a given in the Drupal 5 era that you can't pre-process theme functions. If you're using theme item list in Drupal 5, you can't alter those variables before they get to the function that prints them. We can do that now in Drupal 7, but at the time, it was simply harder to make minor tweaks to CSS classes. So we didn't. In the Drupal 5 era, we didn't have this robust concept of view modes. We had build modes, basically full and teaser, but the common building tool that we have now of adding view modes for every way you want your node to look, that just wasn't quite so available. So we used my go-to tool back when I wrote a lot of CSS was body classes. I'm glad I don't write CSS anymore because body classes was my go-to tool. If I wanted to make something more specific, I'm going to use a body class that tells me something about the page that I'm on. So in 2009, Colleen said, Drupal is not a build a template first system. You install a module and you theme it. Don't attempt to write a template of exactly the markup you want. That's going to be too hard. George Demet, the owner of Palantir, said, Do as much as possible in CSS. Don't touch template.php. Don't override your TPLs because it's not necessary. If you leave those intact as they are, your theme is going to be more portable, more upgradable, more maintainable. These are still good goals. We still want themes that are portable, upgradable, maintainable. The way we went about it was different. Colleen got really explicit about it and just said, stop trying to mess with the HTML. It's not worth it. You can do everything in CSS. With this attitude, what kind of CSS do you get? You get CSS like field, headline. Again, it's a descriptive class name, or a class like views, field, headline, value. This is a long class name, but it tells us exactly where it's coming from. We know that this class is coming from the views module. We know that views module is calling the field module. We know that the field module is rendering field headline, specifically the database column value. This is a really descriptive class name, but it's completely coupled to the internal modules that produced it. If you upgrade to a new version of Drupal, this class is going to be different because some detail about the way Drupal has produced these classes will change. You'll still get a similarly descriptive class name, but it's not going to be the same as if you had just handwritten your templates and connected those handwritten templates to Drupal 5 or Drupal 6 or Drupal 7. In a world where CSS is your API to the browser, the more CSS selectors you have, the better. A lot of people make fun of the 10 layers of divs, but that's good if modifying the HTML is too painful. If modifying the HTML is too painful and not an option, then the more HTML you have, the better, because you can pick and choose which layers you use. More divs, the better. Longer class names, the better, because the longer class names mean they're descriptive. Views, field, headline, value tells you exactly where it's coming from. Long multi-element selectors get really tempting. If you don't have view modes that let you segment the theming of your node, then you need to use other indicators like what's the machine name of the view that I'm in, or what's a class on the body tag. That allows me to vary the way field-image gets rendered. So Drupal exposes each internal data model layer as a wrapping HTML element. In this world, what are we doing? We're making Drupal elements look like the design. Our design is in Photoshop. We don't have the option to be the design. We're trying to look like the design. I think Stephen Colbert's set is a good way of understanding this. Above his fireplace, he's got a Latin phrase that translates to seem to be rather than to be. That's an inversion, I think, of the North Carolina State motto, which says, be the thing rather than seeming to be the thing. Don't pretend to be, don't appear to be, actually be. But in the Drupal 5 era, we don't have the option to be the design. Our best bet is a pixel-perfect matching of the design. The dream is to look like the design as much as possible. Now, as we're designing in the browser, we have the option to be the design. But if your design is simply a picture of a website, then your real website can try to look like it, but it can't be it. So that moves us forward in time to what I'll call the past-ish present. In the Drupal 6, Drupal 7 era, when we start adding tools, trying to make our lives easier, we start chasing easy, and we lose simplicity. So Larry Garfield, one of our developers at Palantir, now one of the leads for Drupal 8's Whiskey initiative, he wrote a blog post called Sustainable Building Blocks. So building on this idea of sustainability. He also thought overriding template files isn't a good option. Don't do that. Write a new field formatter. If you write a new field formatter instead of overriding the template of the field formatter, you get something that's encapsulated, portable. If you make a field formatter and put it into a module, you have the option of taking that module from your current project, bringing it over to the next project, and the next, and the next, and the next. So these are good goals. We want encapsulation, we want portability, we want flexibility. And fields isn't the only place we can do this. We can do this in views module. You can write a style plugin, a row plugin, a display plugin, an argument handler. All of these programmatic ways of manipulating and controlling markup. Larry, like myself, like just about every Drupal developer at the time, wrote a views plugin to take the jQuery cycle plugin and connect it to views. Who did that? Who had to connect jQuery cycle to views in some way, shape, or form? I think just about every project at the time needed to have a slideshow on the homepage. So here we have the option of being the slideshow. This is the template from the view cycle module. I can tell from the classes that this thing knows it's jQuery cycle. Instead of writing CSS and JavaScript that looks for the machine name of the view and tries to build off that, we can use this display plugin that says, I am a slideshow. I am jQuery cycle. So why do you do this? Yeah, you need to learn another API. You need to learn how to write a view style plugin. But when you do that, you get something that's cleaner, more extensible, more reusable. But what are we doing? Are we writing CSS to make a view look like a slideshow? Or are we making a display plugin that lets the view be the slideshow? This is a question that gets answered inconsistently, often on the same project. One person who's really comfortable with JavaScript and CSS, but not comfortable writing PHP to make a new display plugin, is going to say, I know JavaScript and CSS. I can really easily turn this markup into a slideshow. That's easy. All I need to do is write this little bit of JavaScript and write this little bit of CSS, and boom, I've got a slideshow. Done. It looks like the design. Or you might think, I know PHP, but I'm not at all comfortable writing JavaScript and CSS. I know that the jQuery cycle module has this example. The example says, structure your markup exactly like this, drop in this JavaScript that you don't have to alter, and boom, you'll get a slideshow. Both of those feel easy to different groups of people. And if you don't talk about the way you're doing it on a project, different people will answer easy in different ways. In Drupal 7's complexity clouds this question. When there are so many tools in Drupal available for modifying markup, creating new markup, it's hard to even realize that there's this question of, are you making a new thing, or are you overriding an existing thing? Just in Core, we've got preprocess functions available in modules and themes, process functions, which are like preprocess functions, but yet different. We've got theme hook suggestions for overriding individual theme functions and templates. You can add a field formatter if you want. You can use hook field extra fields if you need to add more stuff. You can write a new theme function if you want to do that. You can use the render arrays to manipulate their information. You can just shove stuff onto a node object in the hook node load if you want. And in Contrib, you can use the panels suite, of which there are a bunch of different modules. You can use display suite. You can use views display plugins. You can suppress unwanted divs with the fences module. You can add more view modes. And rendering in Drupal starts to feel like a game of Plinko, where you're dropping your data in on one end. It hits a bunch of different bars that change the way it works. And you hope that at the other end, you get out what you wanted. Now if you started with the end, if you started with the template that you know you want, the markup that you know you want, and you're dropping in your data, you might think, why can't I just drop in my data to this template that I know I want? Well, because there are all of these different layers through which the data has to pass. Or maybe it feels like a game of mousetrap, where you need to set up all these different places and ask yourself, what is the right way to change this div into an article element? So what are we doing? Once again, we're doing whatever feels easier, not simpler. And different people answer easy in different ways. That's just normal. For some people, CSS is easy. For some people, JavaScript is easy. For some people, PHP is easy. When we try to make each of those easy, we're going to end up with a system that is complex as a whole. So why didn't we do something different? Well, in 2009, Colleen identified that this sustainable model, the model that requires you know where field-field-headline comes from, It takes patience. You need to plan really intentionally to know how to work with these classes. You need to know the inner structure of Drupal and Drupal's theme system in order to work with this. The sustainable theming mentality relies on the themer knowing how the theme system works. How many people in the world understand this diagram? If your job is controlling Drupal markup and controlling Drupal CSS, you need to know this. And that's unreasonable. If we're hiring front-end developers to our companies and someone walks in and says, I'm a great front-end developer, I know markup inside and out, I can write really clean object-oriented CSS, I can write the best JavaScript you've ever seen. Working on a Drupal project, we may have to say, okay, great, you're going to need to learn panels layout plugins, you need to learn preprocess functions, you need to learn all these things that are not front-end development. In chasing easy, we lost simple. But there's hope. There's the future-ish present, the era that I call making the markup match. So our givens have changed. It's a given now that our clients want a responsive site. So if a client wants a responsive site, then it's a given that some design needs to be done in CSS and HTML. You can no longer say that you've designed a website by making a picture of a website. In order to say that you've designed a site like this is one of our first responsive projects for the University of Michigan's health system, our designers knew right away, we need to figure out what these menus do. This was when responsive design was a new word and people were figuring out what does it mean to have this menu squish from a desktop to a tablet to a phone. In order to design this website, you need to work in HTML and CSS. In order to figure out how does the body field reflow at different screen sizes, you need to be working in the medium. So then it starts to be a given that our designs have some HTML and CSS. Well, do we want Drupal's HTML and CSS then if the designs have their own? We start doing more and more responsive prototypes. So with that University of Michigan site, the work that the designers did in CSS was all layouts. Well, a year later, they're more comfortable working with CSS and HTML, and they're doing full prototypes. They're figuring out the colors, they're figuring out the images, they're figuring out just about everything. And they're making full HTML and CSS prototypes. And again, we ask, well, then what do we need Drupal's markup and CSS for? Our designers are starting to think in design components. Our designers have their own word to describe what is this square element in the middle. They have their own design component understanding of this is a home page square. That's what we call it. And the developers can say, okay, great. We're thinking of that as the teaser home view mode. And now we have a place where we can map between design language and Drupal language. It starts to become a given that our clients want a living style guide, something that looks like the site but is not the site itself, something that guides the visual look of the site. So if you want a living style guide, then the CSS has to be the same in both places. On some of these early projects, we would make a style guide early in the project and say, okay, great. Then we would look at the CSS that our designers had written, and we would thought, okay, you're new to CSS, so we need to rewrite this, and we're working with Drupal markups, we're going to change some of these selectors, and what we had then was a dead style guide, or a zombie style guide, where we were forking our CSS when development started and rewriting it for Drupal. And then we had cut off our style guide, and it didn't really have a chance to live and evolve with the site because the real CSS was in the site, the style guide is somewhere else. So for a style guide to be living, it needs to be the same in both places. And if the CSS is the same in both places, then the markup has to be the same in both places. So what are we doing now? We're making the markup match, and the CSS just works. So why didn't we do that before? We thought about it, certainly. But in Drupal 5 and Drupal 6, what we called the strip it mentality of strip away all the Drupal markup didn't seem like a feasible option. It was It was too painful. We didn't have good tools that allowed us to connect custom templates to Drupal 5 and Drupal 6. It was easier to just accept the markup that we got. But in Drupal 7, we have a lot more tools available. So if our static prototype written in HTML and CSS has a design component like this, it's relatively simple. It's just an image, a title, a date. And our designers have decided this needs to be an article. We've written CSS classes that describe visually what these things are. They're not Drupal's internal understanding. We've got a class that says illustrated list item underscore underscore image, and we have this SMAX system that tells us how we name our CSS classes in ways that make sense for design, not in ways that make sense for Drupal's internals. Then our task becomes, okay, how do we get Drupal to print something like this? Well, some of these tools have to help. We've got a whole panel suite, we've got display suite, we've got views display plugins, we've got fences module, we can use view modes. Panels has become the tool that we use at Palantir most commonly for mapping between design components in a prototype or a style guide and Drupal's understanding. Panels has this concept of layout plugins. And a layout plugin is nothing more than a template, TPL file, and a CSS file, and optionally a JavaScript file if you need it. And just that. The layout plugin doesn't know what data is coming into it, and that's the point. Node.tpl has to make all these assumptions about knowing exactly what a node object is. But if you're working in design components, then your design components don't know, shouldn't know, aren't supposed to know what is the source data. All they need to know is I need a title, an image, and a date. So with panels module, there's a way to set what is the required data source, what's coming in. We've got a node coming in. We're trying to get to a layout plugin. We're trying to get to a design component, an illustrated list item. So on a full project, we end up with sometimes dozens of layout plugins, but each one is named for the design component. It lets us understand what is this thing visually. And panels module gives you a UI, for setting up how your Drupal representation of data maps to what your layout plugin needs. So you can say the title maps to the title, this image field prints in this spot, the date prints here. We're separating our raw data from our design components from the preparation of the variables. And the nice part about panels is you can use this concept at multiple layers. You can use panels everywhere to do what you would otherwise do in page.tpl. You can use Page Manager to take over what you would do with Hook Menu. You can use Panelizer for view modes, full view modes, teaser view modes, any view mode you want. Panelizer can also be used to change the display logic of individual nodes. I use that as a last resort. I much more commonly like to just use it to say, this is what an article teaser looks like, not per node customization, just here's the design component for an article teaser. And mini panels at the block level. And when you use something like this, you don't have to answer every question immediately. One of the tough parts about theming in Drupal is if every single layer of Drupal is going to add another div, then you need to be thinking about all of those layers all the time because they're all adding markup. If you just want to simplify down to design components, a page is going to have far fewer design components than it has total number of divs. You can ask yourself, what is this design component? What is it called? What variables does it need? And decide later, is this a block as a mini panel? Is this a view mode? You can defer that decision. So in the future-ish present, we try to be the design by making the markup match. But to quote Dumbledore, do or do not. There is no try. And that's my test to see if I've lost everybody. I'm glad to get a few polite chuckles. Thank you. The future. Clear decoupling. The givens have changed again. It's a given that everyone wants to talk about headless, 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 headless Drupal. I promised a dozen references to Headless Drupal, so there you go. What do we mean by Headless Drupal? Well, headless software is software capable of running without a graphical user interface. Great, we've got one of those. It's called Drush. That is how you run Drupal without a graphical user interface. Well, that's not what the Headless Drupal community is talking about. They're talking about Ember.js, AngularJS, Backbone.js, web components, all of these different ways of thinking about rendering HTML. These have different assumptions about the way you render HTML than Drupal core does. And it's called headless. But if you want to make a headless horseman, you need to know where the neck is. If you want to cut off Drupal's head, where do you chop? Do you chop off Drupal's head before theme is ever called? Do you chop off everything that happens in preprocess, chop off all the templates, and say, I'm done with you, theme system. We're chopping off at entity API, or we're chopping off at views module, and that's it? Or do you chop off theme after preprocess? Because looking at those two base examples, these are very different ways of thinking about rendering HTML. In the example of theme item list, you have to figure out all of your variables before you say, now render me an item list. I can imagine replicating theme item list in Angular or Ember pretty easily. It's just a title and an array. And I just need to make a UL and some LIs. That seems pretty easy to replicate in JavaScript. Theme node isn't quite so easy, because if we pass a node object, we serialize a node object and just give it to Angular, it's not going to know what to do with it. Angular doesn't have a clean way of getting from UID2 to a link to someone's user profile. If we're cutting off that preprocess layer, what do we do instead? So, following DrupalCon Austin, a group of Drupal developers wrote this Horseman manifesto and put it on GitHub. They said, the reason we can't do headless Drupal easily, the reason people are talking about it, the reason it's painful, is because even in Drupal core, we don't have a separation between our data and our controllers. They're completely conflated. Where is the line in theming a node between the data stopping and the theming starting? I really don't know. In order to make headless Drupal possible, in order to make it easier, it's already possible, people are doing it, but it's painful because we don't have a clean separation of presentation and content. In order to make headless Drupal easier, better, simpler, Drupal core, headed Drupal, is going to need a better separation. And I think it's good that we've got some market pressure on us. We've got clients seeing the value in decoupling back end and front end. I think people will start redesigning Drupal sites, already are redesigning Drupal sites without upgrading the major version. To quote Todd Ross Neinkirk, the guy we just saw a few minutes ago, I think this is a presentation he's doing again tomorrow, the future of the CMS. A common pattern right now is upgrade and redesign at the same time. You're on Drupal 5, you upgrade to Drupal 6, and you redesign. 6 to 7, upgrade, redesign. Because you have to. If you wrote your Drupal 5 or 6 CSS as field hyphen headline, or something even longer, you don't really have the option of keeping that design easily. It's going to be easier to redesign than to try and make your old design work with the new site. And this is painful. It's painful and it's expensive. Years ago, we had Palantir told our clients, if you're on Drupal 5, wait for Drupal 6. Wait for Drupal 7. Skip Drupal 6. Because doing this is time consuming and it's painful. That advice gets less viable as Drupal core's release cycle stretches out. It's one thing to say skip a major version if it's only a year or two between major versions. But if you built a Drupal 7 site in 2011, it might not have been responsive. It probably wasn't responsive if you built on Drupal 7 when it was released in 2011. You need a responsive site yesterday. Are you going to redesign on Drupal 8 before it's released and do this again? Or Are you going to do what Todd is predicting, or what Todd is already noticing people doing, and decoupling? Saying we're going to stay on Drupal 7, but we're going to redesign. And then when Drupal 8 is ready, we're going to move on to Drupal 8, but we're going to keep our new design because it's fine, it's responsive, it works just great. In order to make this possible, we need to know where the line is between Drupal Core, the line between the modules, and the presentation. And right now that is a very hard line to see. It's a given that front-end practices are changing a lot faster than the server side. We don't have the option of expecting Drupal Core to keep up with every new JavaScript framework. There's a JavaScript framework that's going to be released while I'm talking right now. There's a new one every day. And Drupal is not in a position to be picking winners and losers when it comes to Ember, Angular, React, web components. So we need to look for patterns. What patterns are present in all of these modern front-end tools that we can adopt, even in headed Drupal? Can we encapsulate better? Web components, Angular components have a different definition of what it means to encapsulate front-end work than Drupal does. We encapsulate things as the entire theme. It's in Drupal Core. This is changing now, but for years it was common you just write one big CSS file, and that's optimization because you only want one request for your CSS files. But these modern tools are expecting you have a template file, and then you have CSS that applies to only that template file. And they live together in the same directory. You don't have a separate directory for CSS and separate directory for templates. Your templates and your CSS live together as encapsulated components. There's this expectation of data binding. The idea that an Angular component say, just give me a JSON object and I want to be able to pass in and out. I might change the title and send it back. This is a concept that Drupal Core hasn't had traditionally. We've kind of got it with in-place editing in Drupal 8, but it's a relatively new concept for us. Interfaces. We're seeing so much power and flexibility coming from using interfaces on the server side. In Drupal 8, the idea that we can define a service in PHP and say this service implements this interface, and if you want to swap it out in order to use a different database or a different caching scheme, you can do that as long as you use this interface. This concept is going to find its way into front-end tools. There will be a way of saying this is the interface that we work with for galleries, and as long as you can match this interface and give us this data in this shape, don't worry about how the gallery is rendered. Just match the interface. Different kinds of extension. The extension and overriding pattern that we've had in Drupal since the beginning is that override pattern of there's theme item list, and then there's Acme theme item list, and it's just a complete overriding. Well, in Twig, we've got this idea of extending other templates, and that's a concept that more cleanly applies to these modern front-end tools. The idea that you can say, I'm like this template except for this one part, instead of I'm replacing this template and I'm completely different, or you don't know how different I am, I'm just a complete replacement. So in this world, what are we doing? We're pulling usable variables into independent design components. We're not naming our template files after our internal understanding. We don't have node.tpl that knows everything about what a node is. It's an independent design component that simply needs a set of variables. So what kind of steps can we take? How do we know when we're moving in this direction? So if you can draw a clear line between your data and your presentation, if you can say this is the line where the data stops and the presentation begins. If your design components can be defined in one place, this is something at Palantir that we're still working on. We have common CSS between our style guides and our Drupal sites, but often we have to re-implement the templates and TPLs, which is painful. If we can define the design component in one place and say, pull that design component into the style guide, pull it into Drupal, and it just works, then we're moving in the right direction. We can name our design components independent of Drupal. So if we can name a design component illustrated list item and know it maps to the article teaser, but not have to name it article teaser, then that empowers your designers, empowers your front-end developers to think, I'm just working on this illustrated list item. That's all I need to know about it. I don't need to know every single Drupal implementation detail about it. So if you're not naming them after your Drupal data structures. If you can make changes to your front-end code outside of Drupal and have it work in Drupal, you're moving in the right direction. So if you can just pull in CSS from a static prototype or a static style guide and have it work in Drupal, great. If you can encapsulate your JS so that your JavaScript isn't entirely Drupal specific, you're moving in the right direction. If you can reuse templates inside and outside of Drupal. And if you can imagine a front-end developer on a Drupal project not knowing PHP, you're moving in the right direction. There are a lot of great front-end developers out in the world who don't know any PHP, and that's fine because PHP is not a front-end language. It's a server-side language. How do we do this? So many designers don't have any experience with CSS. Sit them next to a front-end developer who is comfortable with CSS and they'll learn. There's this idea out there that CSS is too complex or too technical for a designer to learn, and I think that's a myth. Photoshop is an incredibly complicated tool that I don't know how to use. Designers who can learn how to use Photoshop can learn how to write CSS. So pair programming, pair design is a great way to share these skills in your teams. I'm finding at Palantir that our designers were instrumental in getting us onto style guides, getting us adopting some of these techniques. To make the next leap forward, we're going to need collaboration with our developers. If Drupal 9 is going to use web components, to make that work, we're going to need people who call themselves just engineers and just say they work in PHP. We're going to need back-end developers to enable, to empower our front-end developers and our designers. If you're asking, am I making X look like Y, or am I making X be Y? There's not always a right answer here, but if you're at least asking the question, you're moving in the right direction. Because sometimes it is fine to say, I'm going to use this default field formatter and just tweak a class. And all I'm doing is slightly modifying the way it looks. That's okay as long as you know that you're doing that. If you're saying, no, I'm going to completely write a new field formatter and make X be Y, that's good too. Just agree with your teammates on which approaches you're using within your project. Because having inconsistency on this question within a project is really bad for the long-term health of the project. If you're solving the same problem in different ways on the same project, that's going to confuse the future developers and it's going to confuse you in 6 months when you have to come back to it. So if your designs can state the data that they require, if you can say this is an illustrated list item and all it needs is a title, a field, and an image. Oh, and by the way, the image is required. This design component does not work if the image isn't there. That tells you something that you can then take back to your Drupal build-out and say, we probably need to make this image field required because we know the design component just doesn't work without it. So to summarize, in the past, we're making default markup look like the design. In the present, we're trying to match our markup and the CSS just works. In the future, we want our real site's design components to be the canonical design components. Define those design components in one place and pull them both into your style guides and to your real sites. So that's about it. I've got recommendations from DrupalCon a month ago of related presentations, watching a presentation on Drupal 8's render pipeline if you're looking for more concrete information on what it's going to be like working with Drupal 8, Drupal 8's Twig system, style guide-driven development from John Alvin Wilkins on some more concrete examples and tools that you can use. So thanks, everybody. Any questions?
Hi.
Yes, Lewis. Yes.
So everybody will use the Twig system.
Yes.
towards that future tool?
Yes. The extension concept is one I'm most excited about. Introducing the idea that you can say this template is a variation of another template, because I think that matches a concept that I hear designers and front-end developers talking about all the time. If we have this design component, then we have a variant of the design component, and the only difference is in this one the image is bigger. And I can say, great, then to make that work in Twig, all we need to do is make this one part a Twig block, and in the variant, we override the Twig block and either change the CSS class or change the markup. So I am excited for the way Twig is going to enable that kind of work. Also, when Twig was introduced, it seemed like there was an expectation of Twig is going to solve all of our problems, and Twig is going to let us solve site security. You won't be able to run database queries. That's a classic problem in Drupal sites. If your template files are making database queries, that's a bad sign. So with Twig, we can make that illegal. We can just make it not at all possible to call functions and things you're not supposed to do from template files. But in the 2 or 3 years that Twig has been implemented, people started working on Twig at Drupal Camp Twin Cities 2 or 3 years ago. It was an exciting time. And we didn't realize that as soon as it got in, people are then going to start introducing more and more functions available in Twig. So it went from Twig is going to be great because it's going to force us to not do all of these things in template files. And then we started introducing ways to do all those things again in template files, which is okay as long as we're talking about it. So I think Twig has shifted from Twig will be great because it's going to disallow all of these things to Twig is great because it enables us to focus on the things we want to focus on. So I think that's clarified what was otherwise an unnecessarily black and white guideline of never call a function in a TPL to use the Twig functions to do formatting things in the template. There's a way to do formatting in the template. You can open the template and figure out the formatting in the template. But no, I don't think it solves everything because it's still the final step. When you call theme or when you render something from a render array, the template file is only the final step. It doesn't do anything to clarify that concept of are we figuring out our variables before asking for an item list, or are we saying, here's a node, figure it out theme system in preprocess. Twig alone doesn't do anything on that question. Any other questions? All right. Yeah, up here.
So you mentioned the problems with Headless being like where to make that clean separation.
Yeah.
Assuming a future happy utopia where that distinction exists, then I guess this kind of follows that question. Does that become like? Does that replace Twig? Does that become like?
I don't think it replaces Twig because again, Twig is just the last step. What I want to see is a cleaner way of defining how do you get from a raw node object to variables that are appropriate to use in a template, because we're still passing the entire node object into the template. And at DrupalCon, I saw a presentation saying, isn't it great we can call any method available on a node object, or we can call any method available on a user object. And I thought, no, we introduced Twig saying we want to stop this. We want to not be calling methods from template files, but we're still passing in the entire object. And I don't know, could you call delete on the user object that's passed into the user variable? I don't know. That's something I thought of at DrupalCon, but I haven't tested yet. But I wonder, could you call the delete method from an object now that you can call methods in Twig? So I think Twig is somewhat independent of the question of how do we figure out what variables are available to the template. What happens in the template is a second question, but how do we even get the variables ready? One of these presentations that I plugged from DrupalCon is a core conversation I gave called What Panels Can Teach Us About Web Components, and in that presentation I go into greater detail about different models for thinking about rendering. So there's MVC, Model View Controller, there's Model View View Model, the idea that you have your model, your full node object, but then all your template sees is a stripped down model, a view model that has been stripped down to be appropriate for a template. There's Model View Presenter, which I think is closest to what Panels does, and that there's an independent presenter concept that is aware of what the full model is. It's aware of what the view is, what the template is, and that presenter is responsible for picking out variables from the complete model and inserting them into the view. So that model appeals to me, but I don't know enough about all of those in the abstract to say, and that's the one that Drupal Core needs to do. Well, thanks everybody. I think it's lunchtime.